Recently, I've been playing a ton of old video games. I played many of these games as a kid, and others I always wanted to try but never had the opportunity. And honestly, I'm amazed by how well a lot of these games have held up. They're not just good for their time, they're good even by modern standards. Most of what I've been playing has just been console games, since that's what's most convenient to play on a handheld. But when I was a kid, I was mostly playing PC games, and I've really wanted to replay some of these old titles. I think the sensible thing to do would be just to play them on my regular computer, but of course I didn't do that. Instead, I decided to put together a computer with hardware that was produced around the same time that these games came out. This is going to be my first time building with hardware that's this old, so I'm sure it'll be an interesting experience. Everything that I'm going to be using for this computer, besides the case and power supply, is all from the year 2003. This isn't going to be a top-of-the-line build, since a lot of this old high-end hardware is super expensive, but that's okay because if I had a computer like this back in 2003, it would have felt like I had discovered the Holy Grail. And chances are I would probably have become fused to my computer chair. Alrighty, let's check out the components. We can start out with the motherboard, which is the Asus P4P 800 VM, which I picked up for 600 Ukrainian pesos or $12. Pretty much everything I picked up for this computer I got off of OLX for a pretty decent price, at least when compared to eBay listings. This is a socket 478 micro ATX motherboard with the Intel 865G chipset. Many computer components from this era had issues with bad electrolytic capacitors, but all the caps on this board seem to be perfectly fine. This is a pretty feature-rich board. We've got two SATA ports so we can connect some newer drives here if we wanted to. You could even run an SSD with this motherboard without needing any kind of adapters or anything, although it would only run at SATA 1 speeds. We also have a 1.5 volt AGP slot. AGP stands for Accelerated Graphics Port, and this is where people would put their graphics cards in the days of old, before PCI Express became the standard. We've also got onboard sound, although even the nicest onboard sound from this era sounds really awful compared to a dedicated sound card. We've also got 4-hole RAM slots with support for a dual channel mode. You can put 4 whole gigs of DDR in this system. Although realistically, no one back then was running that much RAM anyway, unless you were some kind of millionaire. One cool thing about this motherboard is that it does support overclocking. Although for some reason the manufacturers didn't give you the option to do it through the BIOS, but you're still able to overclock your processor with this board using software called ClockGen. Now, is it a good idea to overclock your processor with an ancient motherboard that has no VRM cooling and capacitors that were known to fail? Well, I suppose the answer to that is pretty subjective. For the memory, we've got 4 512 megabyte 400 megahertz DDR modules for a total of 2 gigs of RAM. And all of these sticks ended up costing around $7. 2 gigabytes of RAM might not sound like a lot, but back then people would be running something like 512 megs in total, and it would be totally fine. And 2 gigs are more than enough for any games we want to play, and for any kind of background processes and multitasking. The sticks I'm using are fairly mismatched, but they are running perfectly fine in dual channel mode. And by the way, if anyone is planning to do a similar retro build, then make sure you buy twice as many sticks as you actually need. And I'm just speaking from personal experience, since as I've been buying up this retro hardware, it seems like half the RAM I've gotten ended up being either dead or faulty. So you're better off buying a few extra sticks instead of having to wait around for a replacement when they end up being messed up. For the processor, we're going to be using a Pentium 4 Northwood running at 2.8 gigahertz, which cost me $3. This CPU had a bunch of bent pins on it when it arrived. The seller packaged it loosely in a box with another processor, and I guess he also kicked it around a little bit on the way to the post office. But after I straightened out the pins, it still worked perfectly fine. I picked this up along with a 3 GHz Prescott Pentium 4, and even though the Prescott is a little bit faster and it has more L2 cache, it was released in 2004, while the Northwood came out in 2003. So, to avoid being called a no-good dirty liar, I will be using the 2003 chip, since this is a 2003 build. There's also a lot of debate about whether or not the older Northwood is actually superior overall to the newer Prescott. I'm not really a master debater, so I won't say which is better, but I do like that the Northwood uses less power compared to the Prescott. An interesting thing about this processor is that it's one of the first to have hyper-threading. This is pretty much the point in time when processors would move away from having just one fast core, and instead manufacturers would start adding more cores and more threads as the years went by. Although most games would still really only make use of one of your CPU cores, and this would pretty much be the standard for game developers for many years after. Cooling our Pentium 4 is a big aluminum brick brought to you by Intel. Before this build, I've only ever handled more modern stock coolers, so when I felt how heavy this thing was, I was really surprised. Also, I did struggle with actually figuring out how to mount and unmount this cooler. I read online that the plastic likes to break since it's so old, so I was really nervous messing around with it. The fan sounds like a car from the 1930s, and even after adding some lubricant to it, the sound did not improve. But I mean, that makes sense. I don't think that these fans were designed to work for over 20 years. So I 3D printed this little bracket to swap the fan out for a regular 60mm fan. I didn't design this part, but I'll link the Thingiverse URL where you can get this model if you want to 3D print it for yourself. Speaking of noisy old fans, next up is the graphics card. And here we have the Radeon 9600 XT with 128 megs of VRAM from Asus. This is a legendary card from 2003. It's a mid-range graphics card and one of the most popular cards of its time. The core runs at 500 megahertz and we've got 300 megahertz on the RAM. This generation of graphics cards pretty much had Radeon completely dominating NVIDIA in all performance brackets. I actually got a little obsessed making this video, and I ended up getting a Radeon 9550 and a Radeon 9600 as well, since I found them for very cheap. The 9550 in particular is a very interesting card, since you can overclock it like crazy. Of course, you would need to attach some kind of fan to this card, since the passive cooling would not be enough. But it's pretty interesting to see how much extra performance you can get out of this old hardware. This really makes me understand why overclocking became so popular early on with computer enthusiasts, since you were getting so much extra performance for free. Anyway, I think this Asus 9600 XT is really awesome. It has a pretty big heatsink compared to other similar cards. The heatsink actually covers up the memory modules as well, at least the ones on the front of the card. The one downside of this card is this tiny fan. When you get used to super quiet modern graphics cards, it's kind of hard to listen to this thing. Some of these fans you would be able to lubricate, and others will be very annoying to get into. I think the simplest option is probably just disconnecting and removing the stock fan and zip tying a regular fan to the card. I ended up picking up this graphics card in a bundle with a sound card for $8 whole. And here is that sound card. The Creative Sound Blaster Live 5.1. Like I said, I got this along with the graphics card for $8, which is pretty cheap. Now, originally, I didn't even want to get a sound card since I saw that the motherboard has onboard sound, and I thought that would be enough. But then I actually heard the quality of the onboard sound, and at first I thought that something was wrong with the audio jack or something was wrong with my speakers, because the onboard sound was basically like listening to a bunch of silverware tumbling around in a washing machine at the bottom of a lake. And I'm not an audio enthusiast or anything. I'm pretty much as far from that as possible, and even I felt like it's not acceptable. So I would say that if you're doing a retro build, then make sure to invest in a sound card. That is, if you want to preserve your hearing. Not to mention, this can actually improve your performance in games, since you're offloading the work of processing the audio from the CPU onto the sound card instead. Alright, now for our storage. When I first took an interest in retro builds, it seemed like so many YouTubers would insist on using SSDs or some kind of modern storage options rather than using old hard drives. Going into this, I thought that I would have to do the same, but then out of curiosity, I just decided to install Windows on this IDE drive instead, and I realized that the performance was actually really good. Navigation is fast, applications open at a decent speed, and wait times when games load are not as bad as you would think. In many ways, it feels like we've actually come full circle, considering the amount of time you can sometimes have to wait for stuff like updates or shader compilations with modern games. So yeah, you really don't need an SSD or any kind of IDE to SD card adapters for these old builds. You're completely fine just using a regular old hard drive. Powering our retro beast is going to be this piece of garbage 400 watt power supply from QDion. I picked this up for $7, and this is a more modern power supply, although it is still pretty old. But there's no way that I would use this power supply for any kind of modern build that would use all 400 watts. There's nothing particularly wrong with this power supply, but all the parts are just pretty cheap, and I wouldn't rely on it to run a demanding graphics card. Another thing I don't really like about this is that the company tried to make it seem like they're part of FSP, but in reality they are not. FSP actually released a statement about this, saying that they are not affiliated with them in any way. Power supply drama aside, I do think that this unit will be perfectly fine for this build. And finally, we have the case. Usually I'm 3D printing some kind of colorful, interesting case for my builds, but this time I picked up this extremely boring metal box. The 2E Credo, not sure how it's pronounced. I got this for 20 bucks, which is kind of overpriced since you can find similar cases to this in any dumpster. But for whatever reason, I got really obsessed with this case and I ordered it new. I really like the dimensions of this case and what you can fit inside it. This case is pretty much the exact size of this motherboard with room up top for the power supply. The width of the case also fits the power supply perfectly, and everything just fits super tight. There's also room for 2 full-sized hard drives, which is nice since we'll have an option to add an extra one later. Although an 80 gig hard drive should be plenty for now. There's not much room for any additional cooling. There's just this perforation on the sides, but that's pretty much the standard for old cases anyway. Also, I'm sure some of you might have noticed that this case doesn't have room for a CD or a floppy drive. Well, that's because I'm just not going to use either of those. The only physical media I have is this DVD of Spider-Man, and even though I have a bunch of old drives lying around, I really don't feel the need to hook them up. This motherboard has USB booting, so I can just install the operating system that way. And all my games are just digital copies that I install from a removable hard drive. So realistically, I have no use for those drives. With everything put together, the computer looks really nice. This case is about 15 liters in volume, and it's mostly just pretty tall. But otherwise it takes up very little space on the desk. And since I'll be using this computer regularly, I'll show you guys how I've got it set up. First of all, I'm just placing it right alongside my regular computer, and to keep my desk relatively neat, I ended up picking up this thing. This is a USB KVM switch. It lets you switch a USB device between 2 computers just by clicking this button. And connected to that, I have a USB hub, and my keyboard and mouse just connect right up to that USB hub. This way I can just switch my keyboard and mouse from either computer just by pressing a button. And for my display, I'm using my everyday 1080p monitor. Lucky for me, this monitor has a VGA port for some reason, so I've got the 9600 XT hooked up to the monitor through a VGA cable, and I can switch between HDMI and VGA just by clicking a button. I know a lot of people prefer to play old games on more of a square aspect ratio, like this second display that I've got, but it's just a personal preference for me since it's first of all the most convenient, and also because I just think the aspect ratio looks better. Like I said, it's just personal preference. Okay, before we get into games, we have to install Windows. I'm going to be installing Windows XP 32-bit, but it's not just any old Windows. I'm going to be using Windows XP Integral Edition. And I am not endorsing this project. I've seen people call out some potential issues with it, but I'm pretty much just using this since it's super convenient. It automatically installs a bunch of useful updates, fixes, drivers, and programs without you having to do anything. Afterwards, the only thing I had to do was install the graphics card drivers. Just make sure you do your own research before installing stuff like this. I think in general my approach to putting together this build has been pretty simple and accessible. All the hardware I used might be really old, but it has a lot of modern features like USB booting that are just completely absent with hardware from the 90s. Windows XP is also really good as far as accessibility goes. So if you want to do a retro build and you don't have any experience with old hardware, then I think starting with a similar Windows XP build would be a good start. Alrighty, let's finally get into some games. Now, when I was a kid, I didn't have access to whatever computer games I wanted. We didn't have the money for a nice computer, and let alone games for that computer. So a lot of the games I would play were Flash games. I'm sure a lot of kids ended up typing stuff like play games online into their browsers, and they would find some kind of site with a bunch of free Flash games. And of course, many of those sites would fill their computers with viruses, and then they would be grounded from using the computer again. But I remember spending tons of time with these kind of games. Honestly, probably more time than I spent playing regular games. So I figured I would try out a few. For the most part, these all run really well. I found that using the oldest Flash player that works usually leads to the best performance. Chaos Faction 2 was really one of my favorite games back then. It's actually a bit more demanding since it was released in 2007, but luckily you can change some settings to make it perform a little bit better. I haven't really seen anyone test any Flash games on their retro builds, but these games were really popular back in the day since they were very accessible, and it's just what you would play if you couldn't buy whatever games you wanted. I recently picked up a soldering iron and decided to fix my broken 360 controller, and after that I wanted to try out some console games using emulators. And surprisingly, I haven't really seen anyone on YouTube try out emulators on these retro builds, so I figured I would give it a try. I was really curious what consoles this system would be able to handle. For the most part, it was pretty easy to get everything working, although I did have to search around a little bit to find emulators that would specifically work on 32-bit Windows XP machines. Luckily, there was an early version of RetroArch that worked, so that meant I had access to a ton of different consoles right away. I'm not connecting this system to the internet, so I had to download all the cores separately, but other than that, everything worked the same as any modern version of RetroArch. I already knew that consoles like SNES would work perfectly fine, so I'm jumping straight into PlayStation 1. Growing up, I was lucky enough to have a friend who gifted me his PlayStation when he got a PlayStation 2 for his birthday, and that was actually the first console I ever owned. So it was pretty amazing to see that you could easily launch these games on this 2003 computer, especially when you consider that the PlayStation 1 was in production until 2006. I think if someone told me this was possible back then, I probably wouldn't believe them. Something like this would have really felt like sorcery. I tried out Crash Bandicoot and it worked really well, but then I tried Crash Team Racing and for some reason the game would freeze whenever I would try to load a track. I'm not sure what the problem was. Maybe it's the emulator, maybe it's the ROM, but it's a little disappointing because this game is a lot of fun. I also tried some N64 games, And at first I tried to launch these through RetroArch as well, but for some reason the core I had wasn't working. So instead I used Project 64, which worked without any problems. I was also really happy with how easy setting up the Xbox 360 controller was. I just installed some generic 360 Windows XP drivers, and all the emulators recognized the controller and worked perfectly fine. And as you guys can see, Mario Kart works perfectly fine on this system, which once again is just incredible. As a kid, I had some Nintendo Power magazines, and even though I didn't have any Nintendo consoles, I remember looking over all these games and wishing I could play them just because they were so colorful and all the characters looked so cool. So having a system that could have played any N64 game I wanted would have been really amazing. So this next game I'm testing isn't exactly from this time period, but I was just curious how it would work on here. Good old Minecraft, version 1.7.2, and this version was released in 2013. So like I said, I have no idea why I'm trying it, since this game is 10 years older than the system. I guess I've just seen a lot of videos of people running Minecraft on ancient hardware, and I wanted to try it out myself. As the observant of you might have noticed, I'm just recording my computer monitor with my phone, and I'm just doing this because if I used any kind of screen recording software, it would absolutely crush the processor and the game performance would drop quite a lot. So I'm doing this instead. Ideally, I would use a capture card and use my regular computer to capture the gameplay, and I might pick up a capture card and do that if I do another retro build. Also for the FPS counter, I'm using Fraps. Riva Tuner does work as well, but only some of the time, and in a lot of games the overlay will get messed up, or the game would just crash, so I'm using Fraps instead. And as far as Minecraft goes, I would say it is pretty bad. The game will trick you and make you think that it's running fine, but then out of nowhere it will start to lag like crazy. I think anyone who was into PC gaming back during these olden times was probably accustomed to very low FPS, especially if they didn't have a supercomputer, but lag spikes like these and freezes just make the game really unpleasant. Alright, let's get into some games that people would actually be playing in 2003. Postal 2. This game is completely crazy. I played through this whole game as a kid, and looking back, a lot of it is really disturbing. I guess the game devs just set out to make something as vulgar and as greasy as possible. The gameplay and the story isn't anything special, but I think for the most part people would just play this game because their friends told them how crazy it was, and the edginess of the whole thing made people want to try it. Even though, like I said, the gameplay was not anything special. I remember even feeling this way back then, because at that point I had already played a bunch of Counter-Strike 1.6, so I already had some standards for what an FPS game should be like. Next up is an absolute legend of a game, Sims 1. For the longest time, I had 4 different PC games: Heroes of Might and Magic 3, Diablo 2, StarCraft, and this game, Sims 1. I remember spending tons of time just messing around with this game. The original Sims 1 was actually pretty difficult. The characters would freak out over any little thing, and it was really hard to keep their mood level high. I also remember one instance where this family-friendly title quickly turned into a horror game when a fire started and one of my Sims just caught on fire and burned to ashes. I had no idea that was even possible, and it really freaked me out because I'd spent a lot of time with these characters and I had grown attached. It's kind of funny how I've played tons of violent and scary games, but Sims 1 ended up being the scariest one of them all. Next is another classic, Serious Sam: The Second Encounter. I had a friend who had this game for the Xbox, and I remember coming over and watching him play it. He did let me play occasionally, but mostly I would just watch. I remember back then I was really amazed by how fluid the gameplay felt, and the variety of weapons and enemies was really cool. I decided to try it out here on the highest difficulty, and the enemies really just feel like bullet sponges. I think it's pretty unfun when games do this to increase the difficulty, so I think if I were to play through this, I would just set it on a lower difficulty. And of course, how could I do a retro build without trying out Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl? I grew up in America, but I would visit family and friends in Ukraine, and I remember everybody talking about this game, even though most of my friends didn't have computers powerful enough to run it properly. But then I would go back to America, and nobody there had even heard of this game. I guess this was because PC games were already a pretty niche thing, and games like this were even less popular. And even though I knew about this game and I always wanted to play it, I only fully played through the trilogy for the first time in 2024. And the games were really amazing, especially in terms of the atmosphere. The gameplay loop is also really fun, just picking up random side missions and running around collecting artifacts. Playing through these games myself made me realize why they had built up such a cult following. This game is also running very well considering it came out in 2007, so it's 4 years older than this mid-range computer. If you haven't played through this trilogy, I really recommend that you try it out. And our final game for today is going to be Call of Duty 2. The single-player campaign for this is pretty funny, considering I live in Kiev, and in the campaign you play for the Red Army and you start out by defending Moscow. The earliest Call of Duty games I've played were Modern Warfare 2 and Black Ops, so this was quite an interesting experience. The gameplay feels very good, and I feel like they figured things out pretty early with this franchise because this game doesn't feel too different from any of the later games, at least before Advanced Warfare came out and they introduced stuff like boost jumping. I was playing on a fairly low resolution just to get around 30 FPS, but I'd say the game feels really nice. I think back in the day, if I could play this game and have this kind of performance, I would be really happy. And I'm sure the same goes for anyone who grew up without access to a proper gaming computer. Alright guys, that's going to be it for today. As always, if you feel like supporting the channel, I'll have my PayPal linked in the description. I'm also going to be working on another cheap small form factor build very soon, and I've also got a pretty interesting 3D printed cube case planned for that build, and I'll share that on Thingiverse as well, so stay tuned for that. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see everyone in the next one.